you very much for joining this session. It's really a great honor and pleasure to rejoin with some of my previous colleagues and friends, and also other team members. So thank you very much. Today, what I'm going to discuss is how so now, as we can see from previous talks, keynote speeches, colloquium, that we can see that our English language teaching is moving toward the online spaces, in part or sometimes in full. Like during the lockdown, we can see that we have to just force ourselves to teach full-time online. So, but this change, the migration to the online space didn't stop with the ending of the pandemic. So still we are having the influence since. And not just that, because of this change to the online spaces, migration to the online spaces, what happened is school and business partnerships. Because we had to rely on publishers, we had to sometimes borrow the materials, purchase the materials. We had to work with the network providers, the government, volunteers, NGOs. So this has made the school space to become really crowded, and we have to learn to work with different parties. So that's where this is what I'm going to focus on, the partnerships, against this background of digital migration. Okay. Maybe I'll use the...
Okay. You can tell me next time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So I will first start with the PPP, or public-private partnership, as the global trend. Then I will talk about how the pandemic has expedited this process of public-private partnerships. And I will talk about my four-nation comparison project. And finally, I will talk about the issues that have, a reason since the public-private partnership has entered the public education provision, and how we can address some of the issues. Thank you. So now we know that during the pandemic we had to do online and then also partnership during the pandemic. And the online migration has happened in most of the countries, but of course there are exceptions, such as Cambodia or some parts of China. They had to rely on TV, radio, or some of the regions they had to print out the materials and then deliver the materials to individual households. But except for those contexts, many countries, they really tried to continue schooling during the lockdown, and so they did at least part of their schooling online. And as I said, that made schools to work with diverse partners. Some like those hygienic businesses, such as providing masks, sanitizers, but also to provide education. But actually this change was not just because, it happened just because of the pandemic, but it happened before, even though not so many people were aware of it. This is part of because the international organizations such as the UN or World Bank are pushing for this agenda. I think some of you might be aware of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. The final goal is promotion or partnership with multiple parties. Like when you are providing public services, you have to involve businesses and other third parties. That's really pushed by all these organizations, UNESCO or OECD. Educational outsourcing is one form of such partnership, and today I will mostly talk about this educational outsourcing. But why? Why are the government and schools pushing for this partnership? It is because it is considered as a solution, a panacea, for diverse problems, whatever they are. And people equate PPP as efficiency, cost-cutting, quality improvement. All these fancy words are kind of conflated with the private these days. That's why I thought I would like to investigate this phenomenon more in depth. And I have conducted this four-nation comparison. I was lucky to be able to involve some world-leading scholars such as Professor Bob Lingard, Professor Anna Cesaroni, Keita Takayama. So we could conduct this study, originally planned for 3 years, but we had to extend it because of the pandemic. And during this pandemic, it also became kind of partly looking into the impact of pandemic into public schooling. You can look at the detail of the project, and then also our talks, publications, public reporting, executive reports, videos that we have generated over the 4 years. But actually, I had another project that was, actually this project was funded by the Hong Kong government, but I had another project that was funded by the government in relation to this topic, which was only focusing on the Hong Kong case. And by now, I investigated this almost 8 years, so I think, yeah, I might be able to consider myself as an expert on this topic. And so, because this conference is about the digital space, so we asked this question. So the study, to explain the detail of the project a little bit, it consisted of 3 parts. So the first part was analysis of the government-generated and school-generated documents. The second was qualitative study involving interviews with the government officials, and then also case studies. And the final part was a survey. And as you can see that you have the percentage in these 3 contexts of Hong Kong, Greece, and Australia, but not in Japan. Originally, the Japanese local government agreed to be surveyed, but because of the pandemic, the school was so disrupted, they didn't want us to disrupt the schools any further. So they didn't allow us to go in anymore. However, they were willing to do the interviews with us. So we interviewed the government officials of the Japanese municipalities in Tokyo. So what you can see is that, so we were wondering, really, was the pandemic forcing schools to move to the digital spaces? And you can see that those 3 contexts where we asked got the responses, at least like 100 teachers were responding, like between 100 and 150. It was far less than what we expected, but obviously during the pandemic it was really difficult for the schools to keep schooling even. So it is really, we had to appreciate what was available. And what we have found is that most of the schools found that this pandemic really moved the schooling to happen at least partly in the online spaces or in full. And in Japan, the government policy makers, they were saying that the pandemic has, indeed led to progression into online teaching. So what kind of things were provided? I'm talking about public education only. So those schools that were funded by the government, not the private schools or international schools. So the public schools, what they did was that they were selling out teaching and learning. It's really interesting. We all know that in South Korea, for instance, we were involving outsiders for transportation, catering, but now all these countries are selling out teaching. And I don't know how much you are now aware of this fact in Korea. I did a study separately in South Korea in 2018. And what I have found is that even schools in South Korea are sending out many aspects of their teaching and learning activities across all subjects. The difference between Korea and all these other countries is that in Korea, it's never recorded anywhere. Because you can understand in South Korea, there's this public sentiment that education is not for sale. It's, this is the ideology, even though in practice, we are welcoming the partnership. So in South Korea, for instance, if it is a designated schools or leader schools, 선도학교, then they would have extra funds. And most of these funds were actually used to purchase services. So now to go back to the project, Australia, Japan, Hong Kong, and Greece, what we have found is that they were actually purchasing programs or purchasing teachers online, offline. They were purchasing materials, teacher development programs, test preparation. For instance, 수능, like that counterpart of 수능 in these countries, they were purchasing programs to prepare students for the high-stake exams. And these programs were not just running after school, but they were running in regular school hours as well. So this is really interesting because in South Korea too, it is happening in class. But when the schools publish the school annual report, the names there are always the teachers who are in charge of these programs, but not the service providers. But that's really happening in these countries. And they are also purchasing part-time teachers from different places. So is it really bad? Not really, right? So nothing is bad in itself. If something is well managed, well designed, well thought of, they bring lots of benefits. So when the schools, when they are purchasing these programs, they can add diversity to the curriculum, obviously, right? So one teacher, so I was an English language teacher in South Korea for 10 years, and then 5 years as a teacher educator, advisor for policies in English language teaching. And so I know if things are done properly, it will bring benefits, but, and then like, if you are trying to learn yourself and then do all these different things, it takes forever. So that's why we were bringing in outsiders. So as a teacher myself, in addition to the net teacher who were dispatched from the government, we were also purchasing extra net teachers so that we can bring in more diversity or more experience of native speaking teachers, But they also can bring issues with the quality of education, equity of education, and deprofessionalization or reprofessionalization. So I'm going to talk about these in details one by one. So we asked in the survey to the teachers, do you think the quality of education, which was provided in collaboration with third parties, the quality has decreased? Agree or disagree? And you can see that at least some teachers were feeling that, there is at least a moderate decrease of quality, if not altogether. Like, instance, in Australia, because I was looking at English as a second or third language. So here it is talking about English language teaching for migrants. And they were feeling that the quality has greatly decreased. But other countries, they were thinking maybe slightly lower. So we can think why, right? I think it's partly because the schools were forced to make these changes too abruptly, right? I can remember everybody was just trying to make do, involving even volunteers, parents. So that created a lot of workload, sometimes conflict, because now there are people who are not there before. And also, some people had this negative feeling about technology. Now you can't touch or meet each other, especially if they are young learners. It's so difficult for them to understand what is going on. And it had to involve parents to turn on the computer, etc. So obviously this is one factor. But also because during this pandemic, the companies, they were really fighting for their survival. Because some companies really boosted their revenue, whereas most of the companies, they were really suffering a lot. They lost their customers. They had to make changes. So that is one of the reasons why people were thinking that this outsourced education, the quality was decreasing. That is pandemic induced, but even without that, there have always been issues for quality when we were involving outsiders. Part of it is because the government, even though these people are working in public education, they don't think this is the remit of the governance of a public education, because these are works done by the private parties. So they didn't think that, many governments, they don't think they have to look into this. And so there are no clear regulations on the quality or what the businesses, educational businesses have to do. Even if there are regulations, teachers, school leaders do not necessarily understand that, or they just leave it to the private entity, whether they are NGOs, whether they are philanthropists, educational businesses. Once they pay money, they think it is done, but it doesn't really happen that way. And also, so for Korea's case, as I said, the fund can come from the designation as a special school, right? Leader schools like Sandohakyo, but most of the schools were using their annual budget. So there is some sustainability for some schools. For others, if you lose your title, you lose the fund. And that happens in many other contexts as well. So, and even though there is, certain amount of money, like budget, it may change the focus. That's what you can see from the service providers' quote. He was saying, so drama is not used any longer. The government requires schools to do STEM, so it was replaced by a program where students watch a 3D video on their mobile phones and answer questions on the content. So before, it was more about language or culture, and the government decided to emphasize science. So every programs that the company has to sell now had to be repackaged to STEM education. And if you couldn't do it, you lose your job. So the sustainability for these outsourced programs, that's always at stake. Why does it affect quality? Can you imagine why? So if you don't know that your program will stay there forever, or at least a few years, and you don't know whether it will continue next year, would you spend time on improving the quality? waste, right? So they wouldn't do it. That's why it is affecting the quality of education. I also said there will be issues of equity. Not will be, but there can be issues of equity. Why? So to go back to the context of digital learning, I think the people who are involved in digital learning, we all know that if you don't run it well, it will really limit students' engagement. Even us, when we were doing like online conferences, online learning or meeting, even adults, you end up doing something else. So it's far worse for kids. It's so difficult for them to keep motivated and engaged. And from the teacher's point of view, so if you are doing a Zoom call, and then maximum number of students you can see is 20, and you have more than 20 students, you really can't see what is going on with the rest. And also, some students, so they are not acting out anymore, so you don't even know if they are disrupted or just can't know. And because they are so small, both ways. Teacher's face is just so small, especially if you are using the mobile phone. Not every student has the big screen, the luxury of having a big screen. So they were looking at the mobile phone. Like there are several children, you can imagine, they are all using this small mobile. And you cannot really understand what is going on. And also the teacher themselves, right? So it's really difficult to engage them. Even though you use all these functions in Zoom or other programs, still, even though you move the students to the breakout rooms, before the teacher joins the breakout rooms, they just do something else. So it's really difficult to engage them. In addition, the difference between the students coming from wealthy background and then poor background, their digital literacy is very different, let alone the fact that the quality of the digital devices and the network strengths, all these are creating the gaps. So that's why during those 2 years of lockdown, a study was conducted in the US context, and they found that the middle-class white students, during the 2 years, they lost only 6 months of learning. However, those students who are from poor background, they lost 1 full year of learning. It was a huge gap. So the equity is really amplified if we are talking about the digital learning. And it really is becoming more serious if we are talking about marginal students. So for instance, if your language is limited, so right now, when I see that I'm not really catching your attention, I use bigger gestures, raise my voices. I can do a lot of different things. But through the small screen of mobile devices, I don't have that kind of presence. Whatever I do, I look like a little ant. So the students are not really affected by our efforts anymore. And those marginal students, like students with special needs and different backgrounds, problems, we really can't do much because right now, if I see that three of us are dozing off, I could easily catch at one go, right? And then also the participation. All of us can talk at the same time. However, in the online space, it's always linear. So those vocal students only are participating. you really can't do much about that. I mean, we do everything, but we all know the quantities are always very different. So the equity issue also becomes amplified in this way as well. And finally, deprofessionalization or reprofessionalization. So to me, these are school staffs, and then he represents the outsourcing service providers. From the teacher side, the teachers had to learn new skills because they didn't know how to write contracts, how to select the best service providers, and then they didn't know how to work across different institutes, not between schools, but with other parties. You don't know the regulations, what works, what you cannot, you know? From the teacher's perspective, I mean the service provider's perspective, many teachers are very contentious. However, because there is no regulation about the qualification of these outsourcing service providers, they are usually coming from different walks of life. They don't necessarily have educational background. Even though you are an English language teacher, often your discipline is very different. Like it can be physics, it can be arts, as you can see, right? So they do not have the training and qualifications. And because of the status, because they just come and go, and students, they know that they are part-time teachers or instructor or coach, and they treat them differently. You can imagine, like, because, so you have to know the name of the students. If somebody is acting out, the regular teacher would know that person's name and then call out the student, right? But the outsourcing service providers, they don't know the name, and then the students know that this person cannot do much, because they wouldn't be able to know who was who when they go back in the report. The person, the student who is sitting kind of like at the front line, doesn't work. And also, really to work, for this relationship to work out, there should be close communication throughout the process. Not just when signing the contract, but during the program, so that the outsourcing service provider can ask questions and then give feedback or get feedback. And then at the end, when they have finished some programs, they could ask whether the program was successful or not, how the students found the programs. But usually, the communication only happens, if lucky, at the beginning. Sometimes they don't even communicate anything. They just pay money and say, come, and then teach the students. Because oftentimes, when they are purchasing the programs, they don't want to be involved too much. They have too many things to do. So these are the problems, and then also the areas that requires the school teachers to learn, or unlearn what they have been doing. Do you agree? So up to now, I have discussed some of the issues. I wonder, if you have any questions or comments up to now. Let me ask a question. So how many of you are coming from the school side? How many of you? So are you teaching as part of the regular staff of the school? Are you a school staff? Please raise your hand. Teachers. All of you are teachers? So none of you are, for instance, you are hired by another institute but providing services to school, or volunteers, NGOs? No? None of you? Because yesterday, there were representatives from the businesses. So today, I know today, most of the participants are school teachers. Yeah? So let's see, how many of you, so it seems most of you are coming from schools. So let's see, how many of you have the experience of working with outsiders? None? One person only? So what I meant by outsiders is, for instance, have you arranged an extracurricular activity and invited parents to come and talk, or business, educational businesses to come and provide some materials? No. So you are fully providing all the programs by yourselves. Yes? Almost. Almost. So these issues is like a story of somewhere like in the La La Land. Yeah? So if that is the case, I would like to say maybe this is the story of a near future. Because what I see is that the Korean government is usually, what should I say? It really wants to be seen as the leader in any field in the international context. And as I said, because the UN, UNESCO, OECD, not World Bank, because we are developed countries, right? So what is happening is that the international organizations are pushing for partnership. And it is already happening in the tertiary level. So university education, especially this university is in the suburban area or other regions than Seoul. They do a lot of, for instance, general English education, 교양영어. Yeah. In partnership with outsiders. At least, for instance, preparing for TOEFL tests, right? For the schools, I think, so Korea it doesn't have to listen to these organizations, but because these organizations, what they do is, they regularly publish reports about each country. For instance, PISA, have you heard of PISA test? Yeah? So we always are proud that we are at least within the top 5, whether it's math test, reading tests. These organizations pressure the government by regularly publishing the outcome of these. And originally this PISA test was done by the OECD. Do you know which organization is doing the PISA test now? Pearson. Yeah, so OECD sold it out to Pearson. And can you imagine what has happened since? Pearson is now making the best of this. So now what they are doing is they created younger, so before it was only secondary years. Now they are trying to do it in the primary level. They are now expanding it for the developing countries. And they now sell individual school reports. So they are making the best of it. Because now AI, machine-coded data analysis, allows tracing of individual schools, individual students. So they are now sending this data to schools and then different governments, and they are expanding the service to more and more countries. When the for-profit companies or organizations are involved in data generation, they always think about money. So you can see that even if the international organizations such as UN, OECD, they are not really trying to make this education field as the market field, but it is happening. And the businesses think of it as the blue ocean. So now I have 5 minutes. So I talked about a lot of problems. So I'm going to give you some solutions. But before I do that, maybe 1 minute. Do you think any of these issues can be solved? How can we solve these problems? Issues of poverty, equity, reprofessionalization. Any? 어떻게 하면 될까요? 교육의 질, 교육의 형평성, 그리고 교사의 프로페셔널리즘, 전문성에 대한 그 감각, 그런 걸 어떻게, 그런 게 지금 문제가 되고 있잖아요. 그걸 어떻게 바꿀 수 있을까요? Any solutions you can think of?
규제를 좀 풀어서 창의적인 비즈니스들하고 같이 일을 할 수 있게 한다면 좀 더 조금 이슈는 되겠지만 이제 좀 다른 접근이 될 것 같아요.
So he just mentioned that if we do not have a very tight control, then it might solve some of these issues. Why do you think deregulation rather than regulation will address these issues?
As you said at the very beginning of your lecture, Korea is very special, other than other countries. So it's two sides of the coin. So but now these days, the moral kind of, what we say is, it's a very just generalization of the moral thing in the educational field, but in the reality,
Yeah,
that's not true. So from the government in the Korean educational system, we can give them more money and freedom to choose their business partner.
Okay.
That could be a model.
That's very interesting. So I guess the answer is balance between regulation and deregulation. So I have only 1 minute, so I guess I will have to show the solutions. And you can get the solutions if you go to my website. You don't have to take photos because I have all these solutions available here.